The morning sun peeked through the windows of Newark International Airport as a man in his mid-30s walked quietly through the terminal. Despite owning one of the fastest-growing tech companies in America and being worth over $4 billion, Mr. Chen preferred staying under the radar. Today was no different. He wore a simple gray hoodie, comfortable jeans, and carried a well-worn backpack containing his laptop. The first-class lounge buzzed with the usual morning crowd. Business people in crisp suits tapping away on their phones, celebrities hiding behind designer sunglasses, and wealthy travelers sipping their premium coffee. But Mr. Chen sat in a corner, responding to emails and reviewing documents for his upcoming meeting in San Francisco. His company, Next Wave Technologies, had revolutionized artificial intelligence in healthcare, saving countless lives and making him one of the youngest billionaires in the tech industry. Now boarding first-class passengers for American Airlines Flight 2847 to San Francisco, the announcement echoed through the terminal. Mr. Chen gathered his belongings, slipped his phone into his pocket, and headed toward the gate. A group of executives in expensive suits walked past him, some giving him questioning looks. After all, he didn't fit the typical first-class passenger profile in his casual attire. At the gate, the attendant smiled warmly as she scanned his boarding pass. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Chen," she said professionally, having recognized his name but maintaining his privacy. He nodded gratefully, appreciating her discretion. As he walked down the jet bridge, he thought about the upcoming meeting that could potentially bring affordable healthcare technology to rural communities across the country. Inside the aircraft, the first-class cabin welcomed him with its familiar luxury. Mr. Chen had specifically chosen Seat 2A, a window seat that offered both privacy and a view. He liked watching the clouds during takeoff. It reminded him of his humble beginnings when flying was just a dream. As he reached up to place his backpack in the overhead compartment, he couldn't help but smile, remembering how his parents had saved every penny to send him to college. The cabin gradually filled with other first-class passengers. A famous actor settled into his seat across the aisle, while a retired couple took their seats in front. Mr. Chen pulled out his Kindle, planning to catch up on some reading before reviewing his presentation. The flight attendants moved efficiently through the cabin, handing up coats and offering pre-flight drinks to passengers. That's when he noticed her, a flight attendant with graying hair and a stern expression, who seemed to be watching him with suspicious eyes. She had probably been with the airline for years, maybe even decades, but something about her demeanor suggested this wouldn't be just another routine flight. Mr. Chen had experienced similar looks before. Despite his success, some people still couldn't see past their own prejudices. As he adjusted his backpack one final time in the overhead bin, making sure it was secure for the flight, he could sense her approaching. The air in the cabin suddenly felt heavier, charged with an uncomfortable tension that he'd learned to recognize over the years. He took a deep breath, knowing from experience that the next few moments would require patience and composure. The morning sunlight streaming through the airplane windows cast long shadows across the cabin, setting the stage for what was about to unfold. Little did anyone know that this ordinary morning flight would soon become a viral sensation and spark a national conversation about prejudice, redemption, and the power of choosing understanding over anger. The flight attendant, Mrs. Thompson, had seen all types of passengers in her 15 years of flying. She prided herself on knowing exactly where everyone belonged. Today, something about the man in the gray hoodie bothered her. He just didn't look like he belonged in first class. In her mind, first-class passengers wore expensive suits and carried leather briefcases, not worn backpacks and casual clothes. She watched him closely as he adjusted his bag in the overhead bin. Other passengers were settling into their seats, the usual pre-flight routine unfolding around them. The famous actor was already dozing off across the aisle, his designer sunglasses hiding his eyes. The retired couple in front had their magazines open, occasionally pointing out interesting articles to each other. "Excuse me," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice carrying that special tone flight attendants use when they think something's wrong. "I believe you might be in the wrong cabin." She stood with her hands clasped in front of her, wearing that practiced airline smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Mr. Chen turned around slowly, having dealt with similar situations before. He'd learned that staying calm was the best approach. "No, I'm in the right seat," he replied politely, reaching for his phone to show his boarding pass. I can show you my ticket." But Mrs. Thompson had already made up her mind. "Sir, this is the first-class cabin," she said, her voice getting louder, drawing attention from nearby passengers. "Economy boarding hasn't started yet. I'm going to have to ask you to move to the main cabin." The retired couple looked up from their magazines. The actor pushed his sunglasses up, suddenly interested in the scene unfolding. Other passengers started pulling out their phones, sensing something newsworthy was about to happen. "I understand your concern," Mr. Chen said calmly, still trying to pull up his boarding pass. "But I assure you I'm in the correct seat. If you'll just give me a moment to show you my ticket." That's when things took an unexpected turn. As Mr. Chen reached for his phone in his pocket, Mrs. Thompson's years of dealing with difficult passengers kicked in. But this time, her instincts were dead wrong. Perhaps it was stress from recent unruly passenger incidents, or maybe it was her own unconscious bias. Whatever the reason, when she saw him reach into his pocket, she reacted without thinking. The sound of the slap echoed through the first-class cabin. Several passengers gasped. The actor dropped his sunglasses. The retired couple froze mid-page turn. Mrs. Thompson stood there, her hand still raised, as the reality of what she'd just done slowly sank in. Mr. Chen touched his cheek, more surprised than hurt. The cabin had gone completely silent. Even the usual airplane background noise seemed to have hushed. Phones were recording now, lots of them. This wasn't just an incident anymore. This was about to become a viral moment. A younger flight attendant rushed over, her face pale with shock. She recognized Mr. Chen immediately. His company's healthcare technology had saved her mother's life last year. "Mrs. Thompson," she whispered urgently, "that's Mr. Chen. He's the CEO of Next Wave Technologies." The color drained from Mrs. Thompson's face. She'd just slapped one of the most influential tech leaders in the country. A man whose net worth was in the billions. A man who had every right to be sitting in first class. A man who, until now, had been nothing but polite to her. The next few moments would be crucial. Everyone watched, waiting to see how the billionaire would react to this public assault. Would he demand her immediate firing? Would he sue the airline? Would he storm off the plane in anger? Nobody expected what happened next, especially not Mrs. Thompson. In the tense moments that followed the slap, Mr. Chen did something unexpected. He smiled. Not a happy smile, but the kind that comes from years of dealing with similar situations. He slowly pulled out his phone, unlocked it, and without saying a word, showed Mrs. Thompson his digital boarding pass. His calm reaction made the situation even more uncomfortable for everyone watching. I'm so sorry," Mrs. Thompson stammered, her face flushing red as she read the boarding pass. The reality of what she'd done was hitting her hard. Her hands started shaking as she realized that in her 15 years of flying, she'd never made such a terrible mistake. More importantly, she'd never let her assumptions lead her to physically assault a passenger. The younger flight attendant quickly stepped in, trying to control the situation. "Sir, please let me get the flight supervisor," she said, already reaching for the cabin phone. But Mr. Chen raised his hand to stop her. "That won't be necessary right now," he said quietly. His voice was steady, but there was a weight to his words that made everyone listen. "What's necessary is for everyone to take a breath." He looked around the cabin, noting all the phones still recording. "And maybe we could all put our phones down for a moment." A few passengers lowered their phones, though most kept recording. The famous actor across the aisle had removed his sunglasses completely now, watching with genuine interest. The retired couple in front had turned fully around in their seats, concern written across their faces. Mr. Chen pulled out his laptop and opened it, his fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. Mrs. Thompson stood frozen, probably seeing her career flash before her eyes. The other flight attendants huddled near the galley, whispering urgently among themselves. Everyone was waiting for the other shoe to drop. "Mrs. Thompson," Mr. Chen said, looking up from his laptop, "how long have you been flying?" His question caught her off guard. She wasn't expecting a conversation. She was expecting security to escort her off the plane. 15 years, sir," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been with the airline for 15 years. A tear rolled down her cheek, but she quickly wiped it away, trying to maintain some professional composure. "That's a long time," he nodded, still typing. "I imagine you've seen a lot of changes in the industry." The world is different now than when you started, isn't it? His tone wasn't accusatory. If anything, it sounded genuinely curious. The cabin remained silent, everyone hanging on every word. This wasn't going the way anyone expected. Where was the yelling? Where were the demands to have her fired? Where was the threat of a lawsuit? Instead, Mr. Chen made a few more keystrokes on his laptop, then closed it. He looked directly at Mrs. Thompson, his cheeks still slightly red from the slap. "I'm making a few calls right now, but not the ones you might think." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "What happened here today? It's not just about you and me. It's about something bigger." The flight supervisor finally arrived, looking flustered and concerned. He started to apologize profusely to Mr. Chen, but again, the billionaire raised his hand to stop him. "Before we handle the immediate situation," Mr. Chen said, "I'd like to propose something that might help prevent this from happening to anyone else in the future." The tension in the cabin shifted. Something was happening here, something unexpected. The passengers who were still recording seemed to sense it too. This wasn't going to be a story about revenge or public shaming. This was turning into something else entirely, though no one quite knew what yet. Mrs. Thompson stood straight, wiping away another tear, ready to face whatever consequences were coming. But Mr. Chen's next words would change not just her fate, but the airline's approach to passenger relations forever. The flight supervisor pulled out his tablet, ready to start filing incident reports. The morning sun now streamed fully through the airplane windows, making the tension in the cabin even more visible. Mr. Chen was still sitting calmly in his first-class seat, making phone calls that would change everything. "Yes, get me the airline's CEO," he said quietly into his phone. The other passengers watched as he waited, his free hand drumming lightly on his armrest. "Hello, sir. Yes, I'm on one of your flights right now, and we've had an interesting situation develop." Mrs. Thompson's legs felt weak. She'd heard stories of flight attendants being fired on the spot for much less than slapping a passenger, let alone a billionaire. The flight supervisor gestured for her to step into the galley, but Mr. Chen shook his head. "Please, I'd like her to stay," he said, covering his phone's microphone. "This concerns her future." He returned to his call, speaking in a measured tone that carried through the quiet cabin. "No, I don't want her fired. Actually, I have a different proposal in mind." The famous actor had given up any pretense of sleep now, totally invested in the unfolding drama. The retired couple kept exchanging glances, clearly impressed by the unexpected turn of events. Even the other passengers who had been pretending to mind their own business were openly watching now. "Your airline has a training program for new employees, correct?" Mr. Chen continued his phone conversation. "And how much of that focuses on unconscious bias?" He paused, listening to the response. "That's what I thought. Not enough." Mrs. Thompson stood perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. The younger flight attendant had brought her a glass of water, but she couldn't bring herself to drink it. Her hands were still shaking too much. "Here's what I'm proposing," Mr. Chen said into the phone, his voice growing more animated. "My foundation will create a comprehensive training program. Not just about bias, but about modern society, about how success doesn't look the same as it did 20 years ago." He glanced at Mrs. Thompson as he spoke. The flight supervisor's tablet hung forgotten at his side. This wasn't following any protocol he'd ever learned. The standard procedure for dealing with assault was clear: immediate removal of the employee, possible arrest, definite termination. Instead, he was watching a billionaire turn a crisis into an opportunity. "No, I won't be pressing charges," Mr. Chen continued, causing Mrs. Thompson to release a breath she didn't know she was holding. "But I want her involved in developing the program." Yes, the same flight attendant. Sometimes the best teachers are the ones who've learned the hardest lessons. The atmosphere in the cabin had completely transformed. What had started as a shocking incident was becoming something else, a moment of genuine human connection and possibility for change. Some passengers who had been recording with gleeful anticipation of a viral scandal now looked almost disappointed that there wouldn't be a public meltdown. "One more thing," Mr. Chen said into the phone. "I want this program to be available to other airlines too. For free." He listened for a moment, then smiled. "Yes, I know it's unusual, but maybe that's exactly what we need right now, something unusual." As he ended the call, Mr. Chen looked around the cabin. The sun had risen higher, casting a warm glow over everything. He turned to Mrs. Thompson, who looked like she was barely holding herself together. "We have about 4 hours until we land in San Francisco," he said to her. "Would you like to sit down and talk about how we can turn this morning's mistake into tomorrow's lesson?" He gestured to the empty seat next to him. The entire cabin held its breath, waiting for her response. This wasn't just about an airline policy anymore. This was about how people choose to handle difficult moments, about finding humanity in the midst of conflict. And as Mrs. Thompson took that first uncertain step toward the offered seat, everyone present knew they were witnessing something remarkable. Within hours of the plane landing in San Francisco, the video had spread like wildfire across social media. But it wasn't the kind of viral content people expected. Instead of another outrage-fueled scandal, viewers watched in amazement as a billionaire turned a slap into an opportunity for change. News channels picked up the story, running headlines that caught everyone's attention. Tech billionaire's unexpected response to airline incident goes viral, and when revenge turns to redemption, the flight that changed an airline. Social media was buzzing with millions of shares and comments. Back at the airline's headquarters, phones were ringing nonstop. Reporters wanted statements, other airlines were calling to learn more about the proposed training program, and social media managers were overwhelmed with messages. But unlike most viral incidents, the comments weren't filled with anger, they were filled with hope. Mr. Chen's company released a simple statement: "What happened on that flight reflects a larger issue in our society. Instead of responding with anger, we choose to respond with education and understanding. Change doesn't come from punishment, it comes from growth." Mrs. Thompson sat in a small conference room at the airport, surrounded by airline executives who had flown in specifically for this situation. Her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. She expected to be packing up her locker, but instead, they were asking for her input on how to make the airline better. "Tell us about your experience," one executive said, leaning forward. "What made you react that way? Be honest. This isn't about punishment anymore." Mrs. Thompson took a deep breath and began sharing thoughts she'd never dared voice before about how the job had changed over 15 years, about her fears and assumptions. Meanwhile, in a downtown San Francisco office, Mr. Chen was already meeting with his foundation team. "We're not just creating another corporate training video," he explained, sketching ideas on a whiteboard. "We're building something that changes how people see each other. And we're starting with real stories, including mine and Mrs. Thompson's." The media couldn't get enough of the story. Some reporters camped outside the airline's headquarters, hoping to catch Mrs. Thompson for an interview. Others tried to reach Mr. Chen, but he declined all interview requests, saying through his spokesperson that this wasn't about publicity, it was about real change. Social media influencers began sharing their own stories of being judged by their appearance. A famous rapper posted about being treated differently when he dressed casually. A young CEO talked about being mistaken for an intern. The conversation was growing bigger than just one incident on one flight. Back in the conference room, Mrs. Thompson watched a video message from Mr. Chen on someone's laptop. "Your mistake," he said in the recording, "could have ended your career. Instead, it's going to help change how we see each other. Are you ready for that responsibility?" The airline's social media posts about the new training initiative were getting unprecedented engagement. Other companies started reaching out, asking if they could be part of the program too. What began as a crisis was turning into a movement. By evening, Mrs. Thompson's daughter called her in tears, having seen the video online. "Mom, are you okay?" she asked. "I saw what happened, but then I saw what he did. I've never been more proud of you for being willing to learn and change." As the sun set over San Francisco, the story was still spreading. But it wasn't the story of a slap anymore. It was the story of how one person's choice to respond with understanding instead of anger could spark a chain reaction of positive change. And in conference rooms, living rooms, and social media feeds across the country, people were beginning to look at their own biases differently. The airline's investigation moved quickly, but not in the usual way. Instead of a standard disciplinary hearing, the airline's boardroom was filled with diversity experts, training specialists, and airline staff from all levels. Mrs. Thompson sat at the large conference table, no longer feeling like an accused person, but like someone with an important story to share. "Tell us about that morning," the head of human resources said gently. Not just what happened, but what you were thinking. The room fell silent as Mrs. Thompson began to speak. Her voice trembled at first, but grew stronger as she continued. "I've been flying for 15 years, she began. When I started, first class had a certain look. Business suits, expensive watches, designer bags. But the world changed, and maybe I didn't change with it." She paused, taking a sip of water. "That day, I didn't see a successful businessman. I saw someone who didn't fit my outdated image of success." Around the table, people nodded. Some took notes. Others looked deep in thought, perhaps examining their own assumptions. The airline's CEO, who had flown in specifically for this meeting, leaned forward with interest. "What's remarkable," the CEO said, "is that this could have been a disaster for our airline. Instead, thanks to Mr. Chen's response, we have a chance to lead real change in our industry." He turned to the diversity experts. "We need to think bigger than just our airline. This is about changing how the entire service industry sees people." Meanwhile, in another part of the building, a team was already working on the new training program. Videos were being edited, showing real examples of bias in action. Mrs. Thompson's story would be part of it, but not as a cautionary tale of what not to do. Instead, it would be a story of learning and growth. "We're calling it Looking Past First Glance," the training director explained, showing mock-ups of the program materials. "It's not about pointing fingers or making people feel guilty. It's about opening eyes and changing perspectives." The young flight attendant who had been on the flight that day was invited to share her perspective too. "When I recognized Mr. Chen, my first thought wasn't about his money or status," she said. "I thought about how his company's technology saved my mother's life. Success isn't about how someone looks or dresses. It's about the impact they have on others." As the day progressed, more ideas flowed. The airline's social media team proposed a campaign called #SeeBeyondAssumptions, encouraging people to share stories of when they were misjudged and what others missed by judging too quickly. The investigation wasn't just about that one incident anymore. Teams were reviewing passenger complaints from the past 5 years, looking for patterns of bias they might have missed before. Every policy was being examined with fresh eyes. "Mr. Chen's foundation has offered to fund this program completely," the CEO announced. "But they've asked for something in return, that we make it available to every airline, hotel, and service company that wants it. No cost, no competition, just change." Mrs. Thompson listened to all of this, still amazed at how differently things had turned out. Her biggest mistake had somehow turned into her most important contribution to the company. She thought about all the times she'd judged people too quickly, all the assumptions she'd made over the years. By the end of the day, what had started as an investigation had transformed into a planning session for industry-wide change. The airline's legal team, who had arrived expecting to handle damage control, instead found themselves drafting guidelines for sharing the training program with other companies. As the sun set outside the boardroom windows, Mrs. Thompson received an email from Mr. Chen. "Thank you for being brave enough to be honest about your mistakes," it read. "That's where real change begins." She smiled, finally understanding that sometimes our worst moments can lead to our greatest opportunities for growth. Weeks after the incident, Mr. Chen walked into the airline's main training center. The room was filled with flight attendants, ground staff, and pilots, all there for the first trial run of the new training program. At the front of the room stood Mrs. Thompson, nervous but determined, ready to share her story. "I never thought I'd be standing here," she began, her voice shaky but clear. "I thought my career was over. Instead, I'm here to help all of us learn from my mistake." The room was silent, everyone leaning forward slightly, drawn in by her honesty. Mr. Chen sat quietly in the back, watching as Mrs. Thompson showed clips from that day. The videos that could have ruined her life were now teaching tools. She stopped at key moments to ask the audience what they saw, what assumptions they might have made themselves. "Look at this moment," she said, freezing a frame where she approached Mr. Chen. "What was I thinking? What assumptions was I making? More importantly, what assumptions do you make every day without even realizing it?" People in the audience shifted uncomfortably, recognizing their own biases in her words. During the lunch break, conversations buzzed around the room. A senior pilot admitted he'd made similar assumptions about passengers. A gate agent shared a story about almost denying boarding to a young CEO because she didn't look like she belonged in first class. The thing is, Mrs. Thompson continued after lunch, we all have these biases. The real failure isn't having them, it's refusing to acknowledge and learn from them. She glanced at Mr. Chen, who nodded encouragingly from his seat. The afternoon session focused on practical changes, how to check your assumptions, how to approach situations with curiosity instead of judgment, how to handle mistakes when they happen. The room practiced scenarios, role-playing different situations they might encounter. Remember, Mr. Chen said, finally speaking to the group, success doesn't wear a uniform. Innovation doesn't have a dress code. Excellence doesn't care about appearances. His words resonated through the room, people nodding and taking notes. Other airlines had sent representatives to observe the training. They sat along the walls, watching intently, seeing how this program could work for their own staff. Some were already scheduling sessions for their companies. Near the end of the day, Mrs. Thompson shared something unexpected. My daughter told me she's proud of me, she said, her voice catching slightly. Not because I made a mistake, but because I owned it and worked to make things better. That's the real lesson here. It's not about being perfect, it's about being willing to learn and grow. The training center's walls were now covered with posters from the new campaign. Look again, one said simply. Another showed a diverse group of successful people in casual clothes, with the tagline, "Success has many faces." As the first training day wrapped up, people lingered, sharing stories and insights. The atmosphere wasn't what anyone expected from a mandatory training session. There was energy in the room, a sense that something important was happening. Mr. Chen watched as Mrs. Thompson was surrounded by colleagues, many thanking her for her courage in sharing her story. What could have been a career-ending moment had become a powerful teaching tool, touching lives far beyond that morning flight. This is just the beginning, Mr. Chen said quietly to the airline's training director. Real change takes time, but it starts with moments like this, when we choose to learn instead of blame, to grow instead of punish. 3 months after the incident, the changes were impossible to miss. The airline's customer satisfaction scores had reached their highest levels ever. Complaint rates about discrimination had dropped dramatically. But the real success stories were in the small, everyday moments that most people never saw. One morning, a young tech entrepreneur in ripped jeans and a t-shirt walked into the first-class lounge. The staff welcomed her warmly, not batting an eye at her casual appearance. Later, she posted online about how refreshing it was to be treated with respect rather than skepticism. Mrs. Thompson had become something of a quiet celebrity in the airline industry. Other carriers regularly invited her to speak at their training sessions. She shared her story with honesty and humility, always emphasizing the importance of learning from mistakes rather than hiding from them. The hardest part, she told a room full of flight attendants at another airline, wasn't the moment it happened. It wasn't even watching the video go viral. The hardest part was facing my own biases, really looking at the assumptions I'd been making for years. The room fell silent, her words hitting home. Back at her home airline, the training program had evolved based on feedback from staff and passengers. They added new scenarios, updated the materials, and included more real-life examples. Mr. Chen's foundation provided resources to make sure the program stayed current and effective. One day, a flight attendant recognized a famous rapper boarding in first class wearing sweatpants and a hoodie. Instead of questioning his presence, she welcomed him professionally. Later, he shared the experience with his millions of followers. First time I wasn't asked to prove I belonged. That's what progress looks like. The airline's CEO received a letter from a young business owner. I used to dress up in suits when I flew, just so I wouldn't be hassled. Today, I wore what I was comfortable in, and nobody questioned my right to be in first class. Thank you for making this change. Mrs. Thompson's daughter, a college student, proudly shared her mother's story in a class presentation about corporate responsibility and personal growth. My mom could have been fired and shamed, she told her classmates. Instead, she became part of the solution. That's what real leadership looks like. Other companies started reaching out, not just airlines. Hotels, restaurants, retail chains, they all wanted to learn how to implement similar training programs. Mr. Chen's foundation worked tirelessly to share the resources, staying true to their promise of making it available to everyone. The famous actor who had witnessed the original incident ran into Mrs. Thompson at the airport 6 months later. He was flying first class again, and this time she was leading the crew. "I saw real change happen that day," he told her. "You turned a moment of shame into a movement of change." On quiet nights, Mrs. Thompson would sometimes watch the video from that morning, not to punish herself, but to remind herself how far she'd come. Each time, she noticed something new: the assumptions she'd made, the biases she'd held, the learning opportunities she'd been given. Mr. Chen's company continued to grow, but he never changed his casual style of dress. Sometimes new flight attendants would recognize him and share how his response to that incident had changed their approach to their job. He always smiled and thanked them for being part of the change. The airline industry magazines wrote about the program's success. From viral moment to vital movement, one headline read. The article detailed how one incident had sparked a transformation in how the service industry approached bias and assumptions. 1 year after the incident, a large conference center in Chicago was packed with people from various service industries. On stage stood Mr. Chen and Mrs. Thompson, an unlikely pair brought together by a moment that could have torn them apart. "A year ago, I slapped a billionaire," Mrs. Thompson began, earning a gentle laugh from the audience. "I thought that was the end of my story. Instead, it was just the beginning." She looked over at Mr. Chen, who nodded encouragingly. The big screen behind them showed statistics. Over 50 major companies had adopted the training program. Customer complaints about bias had dropped by 60% across participating businesses. But the real success wasn't in the numbers, it was in the stories. Last week, Mr. Chen shared, "I walked into a coffee shop wearing gym clothes after a workout. The barista didn't blink when I ordered 50 drinks for my entire office. A year ago, I might have been asked if I could really afford that order." The audience nodded, many recognizing similar situations. A video montage played, showing clips from training sessions across the country. Hotel staff, restaurant workers, flight attendants, all learning to look past their first impressions. The original video of the slap played too, but now it felt like watching the beginning of a revolution rather than a scandal. "The most powerful words in any language," Mrs. Thompson continued, "are 'I was wrong and I want to do better.' Those words changed my life." She paused, looking out at the sea of faces. "They can change yours too." Companies shared their success stories. A luxury car dealership told how they doubled their sales after stopping their practice of judging customers by appearance. A high-end restaurant described how removing dress codes had actually improved their dining experience. Mr. Chen's foundation announced a new initiative, scholarships for service industry workers to advance their education. "Change isn't just about avoiding mistakes," he explained. "It's about creating opportunities." Near the end of the conference, a young flight attendant approached Mrs. Thompson with tears in her eyes. "I almost quit my job because I was afraid of making mistakes," she said. "Your story showed me that mistakes can be the beginning of something better." The airline's original training video had been viewed millions of times online. Companies used it in their orientation programs. Schools incorporated it into their business ethics classes. What started as a viral moment of shame had become a teaching tool for generations. "My mother always told me that success is what you do with your second chance," Mr. Chen said in his closing remarks. "That maybe success is really about what you help others do with theirs." He turned to Mrs. Thompson, "Ready to keep changing the world?" As the conference ended, people lined up to share their own stories of transformation. A hotel manager admitted to previously judging guests by their luggage. A restaurant host confessed to seating people based on their clothes. Each story showed how deep these biases ran and how possible it was to change them. The sun was setting over Chicago as the last attendees left. Mrs. Thompson and Mr. Chen stood on the empty stage, looking out at the vacant seats. "Did you ever imagine this?" she asked him. "That morning on the plane, did you know this would happen?" Mr. Chen smiled. "I knew we had a choice," he said. "We could let that moment define us, or we could use it to redefine how people see each other. I'd say we made the right choice." As they walked off stage, their steps echoed in the empty hall. But their impact echoed much further, in every airport, hotel, and restaurant where someone was given a chance to belong, regardless of how they looked. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of understanding.